By the end of 1980, Friday the 13th had already unleashed a slew of imitators, throwing open the floodgates for fledgling independent distributors and major Hollywood studios looking to cash in on the new slasher film craze, with each film seemingly made faster, cheaper, and gorier than the last. With Paramount Pictures pushing for a sequel, Sean S. Cunningham grappled with the question of what to do when virtually the entire cast of your film and its villain are dead.
So now this phenomenon takes place, and Friday the 13th opens around the world, and it's a big hit. And the powers that be said, we have to make a sequel. And I'm saying, why did you make a sequel?
I didn't think there was going to be any others after the first one. We were never led to believe that.
Mrs. Voorhees is dead, and the image of Jason in the lake is completely a fabrication of the mind. I don't know what in the world we could do for a sequel.
Let me make one thing totally clear. At the beginning of my movie, Jason is dead. There's no two ways about it. Jason is totally, unalterably dead.
They offered me part 2, and then I got the script, and Jason is running around. I thought, what are you doing? There is no Jason. No, the mother's the killer. Jason was a kid that drowned in the lake. Oh, we're going to change all that. Well, they never did. So I chose something else. I chose The Burning, which is sort of a ripoff of Friday the 13th.
I understand that it would be very expensive to bring Mrs. Voorhees back to life, especially after we cut off her head. So you had to go somewhere, and of course Jason was the most logical place to go.
Part 2 was basically his journey on seeking revenge over the death of his mother. And that's a very basic foundation of storytelling.
Legend has it that Jason saw his mother beheaded that night.
If you try to track that on any kind of a timeline, it makes no sense whatsoever.
Just shows up some X number of years later, and I don't know that I'd want to try to fill in the blanks of what happened in between all those years.
And if you listen to the old-timers in town, they'll tell you he's still out there.
He didn't drown in the lake. The mother thought he drowned in the lake. So what happened to this child? He was young. He kind of found a way to survive, and he grew up in the woods, surviving any way he can.
So what is he? Is he living off crayfish by the pond for 35 years and nobody saw this weird kid out there, you know?
The first film was obviously a thriller. It was, it was almost a murder mystery. Who was doing all this killing and why?
My sweet, innocent Jason.
So the notion of having a surprise as to who it is or what it is changed completely. So what the stories became was sort of a ritualized telling of a group of young people who go someplace where they shouldn't go. You changed the characters a little bit, but it stayed inside of a very deliberate form.
While Cunningham ultimately went on to pursue other projects, including A Stranger is Watching, Spring Break, and Deep Star 6. His 29-year-old protege, Steve Miner, was given his first feature directing assignment on Friday the 13th, Part 2.
Steve Miner was definitely up for Friday the 13th Part 2 for directing it. He and probably with Sean's help cast it. They found the location. They did all the preliminary work on the show. And I know that he was involved with some of the writing of it.
Steve had been around all of us for many years. Actually, he was so young at the time, they called him the Kid. That was his nickname.
By the end of September 1980, a mere 4 months after the release of the original film, Steve Miner and his crew were already back in production with Friday the 13th Part 2, codenamed Jason. New to the team was 22-year-old Frank Mancuso Jr., who had become the driving force behind the Friday the 13th franchise for many years to come.
Frank Mancuso Jr. called me up before the show and said that he was going to come down and be a PA in the movie. I knew, of course, by this time his father was the president of Paramount Pictures.
I got involved in Part 2 when I was just graduating college. And my dad knew the guys from Boston, Phil Scuderi and Bob Barsamian, who sort of initiated the first movie.
He, went to work with us and was treated like a member of the crew, became a member of the crew.
Those kinds of experiences, I really feel helped, kind of form what I became as far as having a keen understanding of what everybody does, how they do it.
And he was really just there to learn, I think, and that's how it started. But he quickly caught on.
A couple of the people that were above the line weren't working out, and so they were getting rid of some of those people. So I kept on moving up the food chain, kind of strangely. And I think that can only happen on that kind of a movie.
Part 2 picks up 2 months after the events of Part 1, with an extended prologue that would see the return and the demise of the original film's traumatized final girl.
The fans have told me at convention after convention that they felt, quote-unquote, ripped off about the way Alice died in Part 2. I do too. I mean, she was such a tough cookie in Part 1, and then whack.
That was pretty much a necessity. I think originally she had been approached to star in Part 2, but her agent, as I understand it, just wanted too much money. So she was basically written out.
Honestly, when I got on the set that weekend, I didn't know it was over for Alice until I got there, so it's surprise. They never gave me a script for Part 2. They said, oh, well, it's just going to be improv. I'm not kidding you. This is how it happened. Slam, bam, thank you, ma'am. Roll around on the bed for a while. We're into cut. Okay, go to the door. That was the whole phone conversation?
I just have to put my life back together, and this is the only way I know how.
Not scripted. All improv. All improv.
After Alice's discovery of Mrs. Voorhees' decomposing head in her refrigerator, she is confronted by the vengeful and fully grown Jason.
I shot that scene in one night, and it was a prop man I met, one who didn't check his props. And so the first time the ice pick went into my temple, it did not retract. Yikes.
After an explosive main title sequence, the story jumps ahead 5 years in time as another group of unwary counselors arrive at Crystal Lake to open a new summer camp headed by the enterprising Paul Holt.
I'm also sure there's one thing I don't have to tell any of you. Being a counselor isn't the gravy summer job everybody thinks it is.
And I was a little older than everybody because I was the head camp counselor. He was, thought he was somewhat older and, knew more than these people. He was a little prissy and stuffy or something. I thought that would be kind of a funny thing to do with the character.
Assisting Paul is the spunky and intelligent Ginny, who would become one of the most memorable and well-regarded characters in the Friday the 13th series.
To know that I did one of these films where they get all these women in that are so vulnerable, and to be the one that people think was strong and intelligent, it just feels good. There's
always the last damsel in distress who summons up the courage to fight back.
And then I guess with my character it was pretty great because somebody who was strong enough to fight back and kind of stay present in the face of danger. And I was so young that I didn't create a whole other life, because I think that what was really called for was exactly who you were as a person, to bring that to screen.
Her character was written for her, and it was written well. She was very, very well liked on the crew as well.
Amy slept with everybody in the entire crew, the actors, and most of the people in Kent.
Well, there's something about the chemistry that we both have a very similar sense of humor. It's a little bit sarcastic. We could look at each other and kind of laugh. I think that's why it might have worked.
Ginny, I was starting to worry about you.
Bullshit, Paul.
We actually stayed in a camp that was no longer in use because the season had passed. So we were in these big barracks. I mean, it was insane.
Basically, it was a children's camp, and we wanted to keep it that way. We didn't want anything to stand between the good feelings that people had about their children in a healthy environment, which was a little bit different than the Jason environment.
It was cold. Everybody had heaters and stuff, and it was pretty basic.
It was like living at night for 2 months. You just start getting kind of creeped out.
Everything looks so calm down here. I'm looking pretty closely. I don't know. It would be amazing if all of a sudden Jason just popped out.
They weren't sure which role they wanted me to play, so I wound up auditioning. But I think there was a point where Steve said, "Hey, Stu, tell the joke." Well, yeah, I did. I told a joke, and they wound up in the movie using jokes that I had invented, like this.
Brown and sits on a piano.
Your face.
Beethoven's last movement.
There was a sign on the side of the road in the beginning of the movie, but we do have that sign as a remembrance of that particular scene.
We come back to Crystal Lake to open up this camp again. I thought all of us would have been smart enough not to go back to a place like that. But here we are going back to a place where all these people were murdered.
The first night that we're there and everybody's gathered and everybody's made it to the camp, Paul Holt basically scares the shit out of everybody.
I don't want to scare anyone. but I'm going to give it to you straight about Jason.
I had never been to a camp in the country. So while he's doing that monologue, little Lauren Marie Taylor is thinking inside her head, for real.
I thought that John did a great job of, kind of in the scene of building the tension, then to break with Ted, jumping out and scaring everybody.
And we just think it's going to be a regular summer. The kids are going to arrive, and then these horrible, horrible things start happening. And one by one, Jason Voorhees kills us and continues to do what he does best.
With the departure of gore wizard Tom Savini, another renowned Hollywood special effects artist, the late Stan Winston, was initially brought on to create the film's bloody set pieces. Due to scheduling conflicts, however, Winston was forced to drop out of the project, handing his duties over to up-and-coming special makeup effects designer Carl Fullerton. But a key casting decision still needed to be made. Who would play murderous mama's boy Jason Voorhees? That question would, like the character himself, grow into the stuff of legend.
They give me a black script that said Jason on the front of it. Well, we'd like you, for this counselor role. I guess this was the role that ultimately John Fury got. And so then they said, well, would you like to be Jason? Well, sure, yeah. I'd love to do anything you want me to do.
I could never figure out the deal with Jason. They had a guy for a while, I believe his name was Warrington, and then he didn't seem to like doing it, or he didn't want to do stunts or something, and then he didn't stay for the whole movie.
I got a call from Cliff Cudney, who happened to be the stunt coordinator on Friday the 13th, too. And he had called me and said, listen, I'm up here in Connecticut doing this film, and the guy that they hired to play Jason can't do his own stunts. We got a big problem. He said, can you get up to Kent, Connecticut?
I know that the rest of us on set, we knew that there was stuff going on about Warrington and Steve, and in terms of who was doing what.
If you'd asked me who was Jason, I would have said Warrington.
Warrington Gillette was my Jason Voorhees.
He got all the hoopla, for everything that I did. Cliff Cudney, the stunt coordinator, said to me, you're the guy that was the Jason. Tell your story. You did all the work.
Ironically, neither actor played Jason the first time the character appears on screen. For the film's moody opening, Jason was played for the first and only time in the series' history by a woman, costume designer Ellen Lutter. It also fell to Lutter to come up with a disguise for the hideously deformed Jason, one that could only be called a first step in the evolution of one of horror's most iconic faces.
It was through Steve. I remember him and Sean having these talks up in Sean's office and coming up with designs for, part 2 with the canvas bag.
Instead of using an ugly face or an ugly mask for Jason, he would just cover it completely in a sack or a bandage or whatever, and everybody in the audience would have their own images of what is the most horrible person they could think of, and it worked pretty well.
The movie The Town That Dreaded Sundown had a serial killer wearing a potato sack, so I think that could have been an idea that was definitely well utilized.
The costume designer was the one that brought us the pillowcase to cover Jason. I didn't like it at the time, but I know why it was chosen. It was chosen because it was an artifact that was readily available. That was the bridge to the hockey mask, which became the icon, and it was a great icon.
Once I put the bag over my head and I ran in the woods, I couldn't see anything because the bag flopped back and forth. Well, we'll put double face tape and we'll hold it right close to your eye. This way you'll see where you're going. And it worked marvelously. It was terrific.
But to me, the real talent come in, with Carl Fullerton trying to create this face that was pretty intense. And you would get in the makeup chair at noon, they'd be ready to go at 7. So it's a process.
Another notable character from the first film would also meet an untimely and early demise in part 2.
I told the others. They didn't believe me.
Walt Gorney was just there for a very short time at the beginning of the movie and at the beginning of our production.
I'd say near between the American flag and that stop sign, that's where they had the phone booth. And the actor came riding through on a bicycle when they were in the phone booth and said, "You are all doomed."
You're all doomed.
Amazing guy.
I remember Walt being sort of quiet, but very, very nice, very kind of elegant. Really good actor.
It was interesting, when they did set up that booth in New Preston, they took a break for lunch, and while they were eating lunch, two young girls came and they tried to use the telephone. Of course, it was a dummy phone and everybody was hysterical watching him trying to use it and coming out angry.
Crazy Ralph was choked. He was, I believe, the first death in Friday the 13th Part 2.
Yeah, I kill Ralph with a garrote and a thin wire, and you take his head like that.
What are you kids doing out here?
I'm proud to be known as Deputy Winslow. In the original script, I wasn't named. I was just kind of an officer of the law. But in the book that followed, I was given a name, and the name was Winslow. An interesting anecdote is that I was hired as this cop, and I had to drive a police car. Now, I have never driven a car in my life before or since. And for a time, they were giving me some lessons, and I almost killed more people than Jason.
Now, if you were a policeman and you were doing your job and you came driving down the road here and you saw a shape rush across the road into the woods, you probably would do what that policeman in Friday the 13th Part 2 did. He pulled over, got out of the car, and ran into the woods chasing the figure. Unfortunately, the results weren't so good for him.
In shooting that death scene, Jason has this hammer.
The claw end of the hammer went right in the back of the cop's head.
Before we started to shoot, I went to this makeup place, and they made an exact replica of me, and they put some blood bags in there, and they were going to smack me in the head, and everything was going to go like that, and they never used it.
It intrigued me that we killed Walt and the sheriff so early. And I think that was just to remove any possibility that the cavalry would come over the hill and save the campers. So you knew that they were in jeopardy and that there was just no turning back or no help from the outside going to come.
So there I was, sitting in this fast food joint.
I think that Muffin was, I don't know if it was someone's personal dog or it was actually a trained performing dog. Very likable, very friendly. I think it actually got its name above my name in the credits.
Do you want to dance?
No, thank you.
My character was, just striking out with women and with the girl he was after. But the dog, she showed me a lot of love in that movie.
One of the cuts that I love from Friday the 13th Part 2 is that the camera's on the dog and all of a sudden it cuts to hot dogs on a barbecue grill. And it's just funny, and Steve was like that. He has sort of like very wry sense of humor.
Well, I think that if Muffin was still around, we probably would have stayed together, but I don't want to get too specific about that.
When the actresses went swimming in the nude, and of course that was a big talk in the group, and everybody volunteered to come there and help with the scene. They were looking for a towel boy, somebody who would wrap towels around, I believe it was Kristen, who would come out of the water in the nude. And everybody volunteered.
Looking for something?
I was so innocent, I don't know why I was killed. I don't know why Jason had it in for me. It's crazy. My mother calls me the night before, and she goes, "Do you die today in the movie?" I go, "Yeah." She goes, "Why did they save that to the very end? Is this a snuff movie? Are they going to kill you?" I said, "No, I don't think so, Mom. This is Paramount."
The snare was attached to a sapling tree, and when he cut the rope on the sapling tree, it pulled the rope up, which would have the victim's foot in the rope and he'd be hanging upside down. In effect, it worked perfectly and nobody was hurt.
My head gets pulled back by Jason and he slits my throat. First they put the machete against it, then he would pull it, and as he slid, it looked like it was actually cutting it. But they used the dull side of the machete, and many times people have said to me, it looks like you were cut from the wrong side of that machete, and it's quite true.
The role of wheelchair-bound Mark was played by openly gay actor and model Tom McBride, who sadly passed away in 1995.
I started flirting with Tom McBride very early in the process, and he finally said, "Lauren, not going to happen." I went, "Oh, shucks." He's actually the only one I flirted with, but Tom McBride was great, and he was just a sweetheart. If you watch the movie, the most uncomfortable moment I have is when I look at Tom McBride in the wheelchair, and I'm supposed to be smoking a joint, and I say,
"Toke?"
You can tell I have no idea what I'm talking about. And everyone on set knew it, and they never let me forget it. I was such a good Catholic girl.
McBride's death scene in Friday the 13th Part 2 remains one of the series' most memorable and controversial.
I thought Tom McBride's kill was cool.
He got a machete in his head and went down a series of steps.
It was just seemed so cruel. You know, here's a guy in a wheelchair and, you know, he's got no way to defend himself, really.
To me, that's like, how can you go much further than that? That's really far.
Actually, he had constructed a rail for the wheelchair to travel on and to make sure that the actor would get hurt.
It was a tremendous amount of work put into it. It was a fantastic stunt back down that staircase.
I don't know if you've ever tried to go down backwards on a wheelchair with a make-believe machete in your head, but it's a challenge.
Many of the film's most inventive murder sequences were actually suggested by the late Phil Scuderi, who never took credit for his creative contributions to the Friday the 13th films.
Phil Scuderi was more, I would say, like the architect of the series.
Came up with some great scenes himself. I mean, and it was embarrassing sometimes. He'd get up in the restaurant and act them out for me, you know. This is what I want you to write, you know, and he'd act a scene out for me.
Of course, there was a couple in the bed having sex, and we all know in a horror movie, if you have sex, you have to die because it's wrong, which is not the case in real life.
I thought it was great. You kidding? You know, I thought it was a young guy. You know, you'd be able to, you know, film this, you know, love scene and then get a spear. I thought it was terrific.
Essentially, there was a hole in the floor and both characters were standing in this hole.
Carl Frolerton, who was our makeup guy, I had gone to his place in New Jersey and they had made a latex back, which actually you never see in the film.
So he was actually skewered on camera. That spear actually went into his back on camera. It was fabulous. It was just really fun.
The sound guy, at one point, I'm sitting there on my knees and he comes over to me and he says, how are you? How you doing? Are you okay? I said, you know, yeah, I'm all right. You know, a little uncomfortable. I'm okay. He said, open your mouth. And he blows some powder into my mouth. And I'm telling you, they could have filmed it 15 times. I was having a great time after that.
Fullerton's human shish kebab was one of the many graphic special effects deemed too disturbing by the Motion Picture Association of America. To date, the scene has never been released in its uncut form.
That skewering scene was actually really fun to set up and really fun to shoot. What a disappointment that it all hit the floor.
When we were prepping Day of the Dead, Carl Fullerton said, oh, you guys want to see some of the gags from Friday the 13th Part 2? We're like, yeah, of course, it would be great. Before it got butchered by the ratings board, the fact that the guy's on top of her and she sees Jason coming and she's struggling and she's trying to push him off of her so she can get out of the way. It was such an effective, disturbing sequence that to this day I still remember exactly what it looked like.
For all its gory inventiveness, the scene has been widely accused of ripping off a nearly identical murder sequence from Mario Bava's 1971 giallo thriller, Twitch of the Death Nerve.
It was kind of fun after the fact to discover that Mario Bava had made a film called Twitch of the Death Nerve, which I had never heard of and never seen until long after the fact.
This is going to sound really, really weird, but I was a great screamer. I hope nobody takes that the wrong way. But I was. I could scream. I mean, I was really good at that. And I think once they figured that out, they decided, okay, we're going to have her scream a lot. So they made it really long. And it started with just that little swipe on the leg where he kind of missed whatever he wanted to cut off. But then he kept, it was like, yeah. They didn't use a dummy for that when they dragged me down the stairs. They actually dragged me down the stairs. So when you saw my feet going boom, 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 that was a crew member dragging me down the stairs.
There was a scene later on where everybody's at the bar and everybody's, partying while the rest of us are getting killed.
What if there is a Jason?
Oh, bullshit. Jenny?
I mean, let's try to think beyond the legend, put it in real terms. I mean, what would it be like today?
The character of Janie Field, she somehow really understood that there's more to a person than just the bad side. And everyone wants to demonize somebody. And so she had some kind of insight that something had to go wrong somewhere in his childhood or his upbringing.
He must have seen his mother get killed, and all just because she loved him.
I think Ginny kind of understood that there's more to it than just this demon guy with the pillowcase over his head.
We went to that bar, and none of those people, I think, had ever seen a movie, had been around a movie, and they were all hired as extras, and it was pretty funny. And we actually started drinking a bit in that scene, so by the time 4 a.m. came along, we just kept drinking.
Arguably the luckiest character is fun-loving prankster Ted, who decides to stay behind at the bar, thereby escaping certain death.
I did another movie, the John Carpenter film Christine, and there's a scene in that where I got killed, where I got squished, and they originally filmed it as me getting crushed underneath a car coming down. In the movie, they wound up not using that scene, and I'm convinced that it's because I don't die good. So I'm glad that they didn't try to kill me here, because, to make believe you're dying as an actor, it's got to be one of the silliest things for a grown-up to do.
This is the site of the old Lake Warma Casino, and this burned down about a year after it was used for some scenes in Friday the 13th, Part 2.
It starts to rain, and Amy Steele and John Fury are coming out of the bar, and they're about to get into her little red Volkswagen. But I convinced Steve Miner that I could run through the scene in the parking lot. As they're getting in the car, you can see me running into the restaurant. You can't even tell that it's anything other than a body running through the rain. But it's me. I come back from the dead.
Unaware of the carnage that has occurred in the main cabin, Ginny and Paul make a gruesome discovery, and the terrifying final confrontation with Jason begins.
So when I'm down there waiting, they're coming in, and I'm behind the couch, I was like a little kid, you know what I mean? I was like, I couldn't wait. I said, oh, this is going to be good, Amy with the screaming and the whole thing, and that's when the chase scene started.
There was a lot of physical action in the film. I had to jump out of this window, and I remember the stunt guy said, maybe you could get a stunt adjustment for that. But yeah, it was a lot of running, splashing through the puddles, jumping, hiding. A lot of us hiding.
I really like Amy. I mean, I always liked Amy. I mean, she brought a great sort of buoyancy to whatever she did. I mean, she came in, she was enthusiastic, she was down with whatever the program was.
Here I am under the bed, and Jason's walking around, and I'm scared to death, and all of a sudden a rat comes right in front of my face. I thought Ginny was so scared she peed her pants. Maybe it was the rat. I don't know. But it wasn't a large amount of pee for a rat.
I got to give Amy Steele a lot of credit, because all during the filming, Amy never spoke to me off camera.
I didn't have much communication with him, or I kind of kept him very separate.
Amy was non-existent. She didn't want to come near me. She didn't want to know anything about me. I respected that. I stayed away from her as well.
But mostly, they would shoot him and then shoot me, so we were never exactly at the same place at the same time, with the exception of the sweater scene.
That final scene we used to call Chez Jason, where Amy goes and dresses up as Mrs. Voorhees, and Jason is somewhat stunned by, wait a minute, this is my mom, and she psychs him out.
In her only cameo in any of the Friday the 13th sequels, Betsy Palmer appears to Jason as the ghostly visage of Mrs. Voorhees.
They said, would I come and let them make up my head again, and that they needed that and do a few voiceovers. And I said, sure, I'll do that, which I did.
He's a tragic figure because he was looking for his mother. Now, here, after all this time, Amy's in the lair, and she says,
Jason, Mother is talking to you!
Jason, Mother is talking to you.
And when I listened to what she said, that's when I did the tilt the head.
Is that my mother? Is that my mother? My heart broke. I really felt bad for poor Jason.
I felt what I was doing through the whole thing. I really did.
That was the point of the film where I went, that's really where we're going. That's what the sound of this is. So there was a certain ethereal, sort of spacey kind of sound that permeated the picture from the beginning.
I have the machete behind my back, and I'm instructed to pull the machete up. And just as Mrs. Voorhees' face is revealed, he's supposed to bring up this pickaxe. And then that's when I bring the machete down.
There was a lot of discussion before that scene was shot. It was ultimately decided that Amy could do it. So Cliff took her and he walked her through it a couple of times on what would happen. Make sure you hit the pickaxe in the middle and so forth and so on. She is a great actress, but unfortunately that day for me, she was trying to kill me.
So I guess I got really anxious and I brought the machete down when he still had the pickaxe like this as opposed to this.
She missed the pickaxe and she came down on my finger.
And I felt so bad. But the actor who played Jason was really cool about it. You know, he just said, hey, this is what happens. This is what happens when you're a stunt person. So then he goes to the hospital. I think he had the machete through his chest or something and walks into the emergency room and they're like, oh my God.
I'm walking in with the machete sticking out of my shoulder and everybody in the emergency room went, and I walked up to the desk. I says, have you got anything for a headache? I got a very bad headache.
They stitched him up, but he was professional. He came back and they finished the scene with the bandage under the shirt.
And I have 13 stitches in this finger to show you. It's right here. This right here is 13 stitches. So very apropos.
Muffin comes tottering in. Oh, Muffin, you're alive.
Muffin. The scene where Jason comes careening through the window, look, you thought he was dead, and it's the greatest shock.
I know that the Jason coming through the window was a nightmare for me. I had to do it 3 times. It was really scary.
And yeah, it's plenty scary, the mystery of the unknown. What is behind that potato sack?
We never saw the makeup, and he didn't want me to see it, and so he wanted to look really real. You know, because we could have walked up to the makeup area and seen what this guy looked like, so we wouldn't have been as shocked when he blasts through the window.
They built a platform outside the house. The platform was probably 4 feet long. So we coordinated how many steps it takes. So 1, 2, 3, boom, through the window. And at this time in my life, I was not a well-seasoned stuntman. So this was the first time I jumped through a window.
Steve was, he knew how I felt about that scene. And I remember he was, he goes, hey, let's go have lunch. And just trying to kind of play it really cool and not let me know. And then all of a sudden he said, guess what? We have to reshoot that scene again. Ruined my day.
But anyway, look, the proof is in the scene because we got it right. And people are still talking.
Much like its predecessor, Part 2's ending would ultimately pose more questions than it answered. Chief among them, what happened to Paul?
The end of Friday the 13th Part 2 is still one of the most confusing endings of that series.
Didn't know what happened to my character. Like she said at the end of the movie, she says, and they said, we don't know, we haven't found him yet. So they purposely left it ambiguous.
And I'm not sure exactly what did happen to Paul. Too bad he didn't come back in Part 3.
As noted, we've seen a dog that earlier in the film, it's suggested has been killed, shows up again. There is, of course, some speculation that it's a dream ultimately.
Maybe that's one of the good parts of the movie is that you get to decide that for yourself.
I guess there was talk of an alternate ending. It was not anything that was prominent when we were shooting it.
At the very end, they zoom in on Mrs. Voorhees' head, who was just sort of sitting there on the altar. I know when they were shooting it, I think they couldn't decide whether the eyes should open or not. I think that they did make her eyes go open.
Although the alternate ending of Friday the 13th Part 2 remains unreleased, production stills have surfaced of actress Connie Hogan, who played the decapitated head of Mrs. Voorhees in the film's unused final shot.
In my world, that was never a serious contender for an alternative ending, and we spent a lot of time getting it right, and we did. It's a fabulous ending.
One of the guys came to me, and I was in the camp office, and he said, thanks a lot. We left you a thank you down at the lake. I came down there, and what I found was a head hanging from a tree in a little net basket. And I guess that was my thank you for the courtesies extended to these guys in the cast who were down there. So I still have that head, and I've had a lot of fun with it over the years. As a matter of fact, I've had a number of people who wanted to purchase that and the Crystal Lake sign, but they bring back too many happy memories to me.
Paramount Pictures released Friday the 13th Part 2 on April 30th, 1981. Continuing the original film's winning ad campaign, highlighting the escalating body count, Part 2 brought in a final domestic box office take of $21.7 million. Even if the sequel didn't achieve the monster success of the original, it was still a bona fide moneymaker. If nothing more, it proved there was much more lifeblood to be drained from Jason Voorhees.
The film came out and was amazingly successful. We were all very proud of it. We made it on a very small budget in pretty adverse circumstances.
You know, somebody from Paramount called me up one day and they said, "You're starring in the #1 box office movie in America." You know, it sort of sinks in then. And I'm glad that it's an iconic kind of horror movie.
I was shocked. I had no idea that there was such a fan base for this film and for Ginny. And everyone I've met has been excited and just been nothing but gracious.
When I got involved in the second Friday the 13th, I had never seen the first one. So I didn't know what I was getting into. And I very quickly had to sort of get up to speed, and I very quickly had to sort of assimilate myself into a place that I hadn't been. But because of the opportunity and the faith that people had in me, that they gave me, it turned out to be like a life-changing sort of dynamic for me.
We were actually shooting the end of the movie, and Frank came up and he said, "Can I talk to you a minute?" And I said, "Sure." So he said, I have 2 job offers when this film's over. He said, one of them I can be Robert Evans' assistant, who's doing a film for Paramount, or I can produce my own film. Which do you think I should do? And I said, I think you should do your own film. I think that would be great for you. I think you're ready to do that. And I was just really thrilled that he asked. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And it turned out to be Friday the 13th, Part 3. And off he went. And he did a great job with the series. So.
I had no idea it was going to work the way it did. In fact, I really thought it wasn't going to work the way it did. And I'm delighted to have been so wrong.